I rise today, Madam President, to talk about President Obama's speech today on the support of the Arab Spring, or at least what we're calling the Arab Spring. I believe and hope that, as many of my colleagues do, that it's in the United States' best interest to advance freedom in the Middle East. Supporting free people and democratic governments has always guided American foreign policy. Lending our support to people who yearn for freedom is really part of our national DNA, and doing so in a practical and pragmatic way within the context of regional stability is imperative to our own national security. In recent weeks, I've been very supportive of the President's actions as they related to Osama bin Laden and the decisions that were made there. In recent months, I've thought that the President has been a little unsteady in advancing the principles that I mentioned earlier. He demonstrated uncertainty in dealing with President Mubarak before withdrawing his support, and if I can say so, withdrawing his support suddenly. After hesitating for several weeks and allowing Mr. Gaddafi to regroup, we then authorized U.S. participation in a NATO air operation with a confusing mission that doesn't have the kind of U.S. leadership that it might have benefited from. And then in Syria, we stood on the sidelines for weeks while terrible things happened to pro-freedom demonstrators before we finally announced a series of sanctions just this week. Of course, we all recall that in 2009, the Iranian regime possibly could have been unseated by proponents of freedom. At that time, the President and the United States barely lifted a finger to support those elements. Indeed, the President's entire narrative has been unclear since he took office, as it relates since the time he took office, from the time of his Cairo speech in 2009. I think that speech has left our friends in the Arab world both disillusioned and confused. Nobody from the American people to the Arab streets seems sure what our policy is in support of freedom. So I was very interested in the President's speech regarding a new American policy in the region targeted toward rapidly changing situations in the Middle East. The President laid out a plan for an aid program for some Middle Eastern countries whose internal stability is challenged by recent events. The plan would consist of a combination of grants, of loans, of debt forgiveness, and the President's plan, I believe, Madam Speaker, has merit. Madam President, has merit, and there is value to a robust role for the United States to support these certain governments at a critical time. However, it's important that we recognize that any support given to these emerging or existing Arab governments can only be helpful to them if they're helpful to themselves. I believe that Congress must be a partner in the development of this package for it to work. Congress will have to ensure that whatever aid is given is both targeted toward an outcome that is in the national security interest of the United States and doesn't increase the U.S. deficit. So it'll be a matter of looking at where we can find resources to use them in this new and different way. My support for the President's idea will also be contingent on several principles being met by the government that receives any U.S. aid. As a member of the Foreign Appropriations Committee, I'm going to be looking for things where the President would certify that the following conditions are being met to proceed further with this plan that he outlined today. First, I think the government and its leaders must reject all forms of terrorism if they expect to receive this kind of assistance from us. Secondly, they must demonstrate a credible plan for economic development and poverty reduction. Lack of access to economic opportunity has been the driving force behind what's happened in these countries. It was not about us. It was not about Israel. It was about jobs and food and economic opportunity. And so that has to be one of the criteria that these governments would be looking at. Third, they need to demonstrate a record of support for the rule of law, a prerequisite for ensuring that U.S. aid dollars will not be used to subvert the system of justice or to jail opponents or to undermine constitutional government. Fourth, they must respect minority and religious freedoms, including women's rights. Fifth, they must have a sustained commitment to democratic reform and institution building. Nobody believes that democratic societies spring up overnight, but recent months remind us that failing to demonstrate commitment to more open systems of government can end in upheaval and force change. Six, these governments, if we help them, must respect international norms such as honoring their treaty obligations and respecting universal human rights. And lastly, but certainly not least, any government participating in the aid package like the one the President talked about today must be committed to regional peace. And in particular, Madam President, that includes peace with Israel. Israel has both the most to gain and the most to lose as new attitudes toward freedom and democracy spread throughout the Middle East. Leaders that are tempted to bait their populations with anti-Semitism and then respond to their passions may be even more dangerous to Israel than the regimes that they're replacing. But an adage of international relations is that truly free and democratic societies respect others' existence, recognize one another's right to peace, and solve their conflicts through peaceful resolution, not violence, not threats, not terror. As nations throughout the Middle East undergo change, we should closely monitor their attitudes toward Israel. Only nations that are constructive in their attitudes and policies toward our ally Israel should be eligible for the kind of aid the President discussed in his speech. None of these conditions are meant to suggest that these governments must be identical or that their leaders must always agree with the United States. I believe, for example, the Kingdom of Jordan currently meets these standards. I'm hopeful that Egypt's new leaders will commit to these principles as well. Leaders in the Palestinian Authority should look to them as a model for receiving aid from the United States and other Western governments. The President also addressed the need for a peace settlement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It would be hard to find anybody in this body who doesn't agree with that concept. We need peace, the Israelis need peace, the Palestinians need peace, but we need to be very careful that we don't set expectations so high that we create deep challenges not only for that process, but also for the kind of regional acceptance of Israel that must occur in order to achieve peace. In particular, I'm concerned that the President believes that unilateral concessions by Israel, including redefining its borders, are a pathway to peace. I just simply don't think that makes sense. There doesn't even appear to be a Palestinian partner capable of making the hard decisions that must occur in order to get an agreement. Do we really think that Hamas, that's recently joined the government, is going to be a party to a peace deal with Israel? The Palestinian Authority has made real progress on the West Bank in recent years, while Hamas has brought chaos to Gaza. A Palestinian Authority that can't recognize Israel can't make peace. That's why any financial relationship the United States has with the Palestinian Authority needs to be based on the principles I just described. In his famous Westminster speech in 1982, President Reagan told the world the following: while we must be cautious about forcing the pace of change, we must not hesitate to declare our ultimate objectives and to take concrete actions to move toward them. We must be staunch in our conviction that freedom is not the sole prerogative of a lucky few, but the inalienable and universal right of all human beings. I believe those words are no less true today, 30 years later, than they were then. We're at an extremely important moment as we watch a movement toward freedom unprecedented in the history of the Arab world unfold. It's important to note that those taking to the streets are not burning American flags or shouting anti-Western slogans. It's also probably important to note that they're not waving American flags. Madam President, it's just simply not about us, it's about them. Their passions are driven by generations of economic stagnation and a lack of political and economic freedom that's left them behind much of the free world's prosperity. These freedoms are exactly what the United States stands for. America's role is to support responsible leaders committed to peace and sustainable democratic change. I'm hopeful the President will work with my colleagues in the Congress to extend a helping hand to those leaders who are truly committed to these values. And if he does, I hope to be part of that process as well.